Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to session 6 of our partner training webcast series. And I am Steve Walsh, and I'm the product manager for the Notes Migrator for SharePoint product Quest. So this week we're going to be talking about tips and tricks for managing large migration projects. So this is kind of a combination of some general guidelines for running projects as well as some miscellaneous topics for migration. Before we get started, I want to remind you that next week we're doing an additional session that wasn't on the original agenda, session 7. So you may not have this in your calendar because this was added after the fact. So if you want to get into this session, you need to go back to that original link um, and and register again for session 7. So if you haven't done that, you might want to go do that. And also a reminder that we're using the beta version of NoteMaker for SharePoint for all these demos, and the beta is available. We'll have a link at the end for that. So today we're going to look at a number of things that are kind of the higher level questions we get when doing migration projects. One of the big questions is around design analysis. What can the tool do? What do you have to do manually? And how do you understand application complexity and so on? So we're going to be talking about a little bit more about in depth about what we do with design analysis and how to kind of blend a manual analysis with a tool analysis and some of the features we have that help you do that and also keep track of your manual analysis as you go, things like that. I want to talk about rethinking application complexity in sort of pragmatic terms, not just in terms of how many agents and how much code is in the application, but really at a higher level, how hard is it to migrate things over to SharePoint? And factored in with that is the decisions that the business owners are going to make. So you're always going to be weighing the value of an application with how complex it is as you decide what you're going to migrate it to and how much new development work you're going to take on. And we'll finish up with some overall thoughts about managing the migration process and how a typical workflow goes and things like that. At the end, we're going to do some more fun stuff. Instead of just talking about the process, there's a few miscellaneous technical topics that we haven't covered in depth in the other sessions. So we're going to talk about managing your doc links, and there's a lot to talk about there in terms of how the link tracking process works and how it might be used in staging environments and so on. And especially it comes up a lot with offshore projects, how an offshore team is going to be able to work with doc links so that that all works in the end for the end customer. The use of intermediate files is a powerful feature that a lot of people don't really take advantage of in our tool. So we'll talk about how we can use intermediate XML files in different ways in our tool. And then finally, just a quick synopsis of how the NMSP command utility works, our command line tool. First, I want to review something we covered in session 2 when we talked about analysis. And this is just a kind of recap where our tool is with design analysis and what we do. So our tool, when we do a design analysis, we will scan all the design elements and we'll be able to recognize how many agents you have, how many forms and views, and so on. And then we'll give you a little nice synopsis of all the design elements. And so you can take pieces of data like number of forms and put that on a view in a report. And that's useful to a certain degree. The other thing we do when we're scanning design elements is we can actually make a local copy of the application design. It's sort of like making a little miniature template. As we scan the design elements, we will copy it locally, and then that's intended for an offshore team to be able to use that. The other thing we can do is we can compare the design elements of two different databases. So as we're scanning the design, we actually keep a little hash total of the binary of every design element. And this allows us to do comparison of any two databases very easily. So the most common way to use this is with a template comparing to original database. So if you have an application that's supposedly based on, template X, then we can actually compare the design elements and we can say, well, it's close to template X, but here's one extra form that someone added or one view that someone modified. So very useful there. And we can give you the details about what changed between the master copy and then this instance of that copy. And this is also useful for comparing any two databases. It doesn't have to be a template. You can compare any two databases and we'll tell you how much it's changed. And so this is a pretty useful thing when you're doing costing of applications and estimations, because if you know that it's truly based on a template without modification, then that will influence your estimates of how you're going to migrate it, because all the applications based on that one template could be migrated with one migration job and one development job if you're doing development. Now at a higher level, we can also do this design comparison for finding the best fit. Sometimes we have databases that don't have templates assigned to them, and so theoretically you could do this one at a time to compare every two databases in your organization, but of course that's very prohibitive. So what we allow you to do is in our technical classes, we allow you to set up best fit class detection, and that will allow you to compare the design of each database with that certain set of class templates. Basically, you'll associate one database for every technical class that you care about, and then every time we scan a database, we'll tell you which template it was the closest to. So this will help you find, more instances of applications that could be lumped into one single technical class. We do some complexity calculations. As we do our design analysis, we use a number of different algorithms for computing some complexity number, and these are complexity numbers 1 through 5. And so the one most people rely on in our tool is the design element index algorithm, and this is a Microsoft algorithm, so there's a little bit of a standardization there. And so the DEI algorithm is going to give you a number from 1 to 5, and the thing to know about this is based on design element counts only. It's not scanning code. It's not parsing the Lotus script code and seeing, oh, this database does something really complicated here. It's just saying we have 15 agents and 10 forms and so on. And so based on those counts, this algorithm published by Microsoft puts it into a number 1 through 5. And as we'll talk about, that's a good first approximation for how complex an application is, but it's certainly not the final word. There's a similar algorithm that we invented called the Quest Design Index, and you can use either one or you can use a combination of these two. It's just another take, but it's similar in that it's just based on element counts. We think it's a little bit more real world, but we're still not claiming this is the be-all end-all, because it's still just based on element counts and not scanning code. We also have a data complexity index, and the data complexity index is telling you, this application has fairly simple data, this application has more complex data. And by more complex data, it has more rich text, it has more embedded elements, it might have lots of doc links or digital signatures or different things that make the data more complex. So if it's data complexity 1, it's probably a lot of text fields and things like that. If it's data complexity 5, it's probably got all sorts of bells and whistles. It's got reader-writer security and lots of doc links and OLE objects and that kind of stuff. So that's about the complexity of the actual data versus the design. And can't stress this enough, this is just a first approximation. This is intended to be replaced by manual analysis. So you might scan 10,000 databases and put them into this initial grouping of complexity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We definitely encourage you, for those that we think might be complex, to follow up with manual analysis. And if you're going to give someone an exact quote for migrating something, you're going to want to follow up with a manual analysis to really understand what's in that application. So capturing design copies is a new feature for version 6.1. So this might be a reason you want to use the beta version when you're doing an analysis project. So 6.1 can now capture the full design of every database scan. So basically, we build a little miniature database in our own restricted folder, and we copy all the design elements and no data documents. So your customers can be reassured that we're not taking offline any data, but we are taking the full design of the databases. And so someone can now take that workstation or just copy that directory. We put all of our design copies in this particular folder by default, although you can change this location in the options. But basically in our program data design copies folder, we will make all these little databases and we name them by replica ID. So, if you have one database that's replicated 3 times, we won't make 3 different design copies. We'll just make one. And we know that that's not perfect. We kind of made that choice consciously, even though we know it's theoretically possible for 2 databases to have a different design, even though they have the same replica ID. We've decided it's worth the simplification here when we're making this collection to use replica ID as a unique identifier. So we're just taking one copy per replica ID. And so when we encounter another one, we won't make another copy. Okay, so you can open these design copies from the console, and then the whole point of this is now you can do manual analysis. When you want to do that manual design analysis, you'll have a local copy of the design that you can look at. And this will save you from having to go back and open the database over the server connection to Domino, and you may even be offline. You may have taken this whole folder and shipped it off to your offshore team, or you've gone back to your office and you're not connected to the customer environment anymore. You can still open the design copy and really understand the full design and play with that. So that's a helpful piece. Now, as you think about moving from doing the machine analysis, where you get this report that says this one's a P1, this one's a P4, this one's a P5, in terms of complexity, you want to take that and you want to go through a series of iterations to kind of both filter out the ones you don't want and then do a better job of understanding the complexity. So the first thing is just to figure out what you don't want. In particular, we'll talk a little later about how you're going to look at what applications haven't been used in a while, or the business says we don't really need this one, or maybe in some cases we're going to decide to archive it instead of migrating the design. And so that will leave you with still a lot of databases that have only the machine complexity assigned. The next step would be to use our classification and consolidation systems that I mentioned, including the predefined technical classes that we give you that will recognize the document libraries and so on, and then the classes that you create for your own templates. And so whenever possible, do the analysis work on the consolidated applications. So if you have 50 databases all based on the same technical class, do the analysis work once and put your manual classification in the technical class, and then you can assign that down to the individual databases using class rules. So this will be more clear when I do a demo for you. But this is an important part of saving you some work. You don't have to manually analyze every database one at a time. First, find out where you have the commonality. Combine your analysis work, record that in the technical class, and then push that down into the individual databases. And then you have all the one-off databases, and then do your manual analysis when it's appropriate. And to do that, of course, you would look in Domino Designer at the database itself or the design copy, and then make sure you have access to the analysis data, because it's really useful to be able to look at the number of forms used and other aspects of that we collected in our analysis phase, to understand how much work it's going to be to migrate things. And then it's also ideal if the person doing this analysis has access to the business users, because they can ask the business users, what is this function supposed to do, or do you really need this anymore? And the more you can talk to the business, the more you can kind of reduce the cost of and reduce your estimates and get more realistic manual analysis done. This person doing the analysis is definitely needs to have a certain level of skills. It's ideal if you have both a little note skills and a little SharePoint skills. Probably the SharePoint skills are more important if you have to choose. You need to be able to understand what you're looking at in Domino Designer for sure, to some extent, and you need to be able to know where the code is, and how to go look at code in an agent, get a sense of what's there. But it's probably even more important to understand what you're going to be migrating to, because you might see something in notes that you will recognize, oh, that's a built-in feature now in SharePoint. It's a simple approval process, and SharePoint already has a built-in approval process. So even though there was a bunch of agents, we know in SharePoint that's going to be easy to do. So ideally you have skills in both of those areas. So it's definitely a valuable person who can do this kind of manual analysis. And that's often why consultants are brought into this kind of stuff, because the notes developers are gone and they haven't really fully learned SharePoint yet. And so a consultant who has some strong skills in helping you look at this stuff is very valuable. Now, I guess the whole theme of this, our tool, and how we deal with analysis is that the manual complexity analysis trumps the computed complexity. So as you go in and assign complexity based on a technical class, or manually set the complexity based on a manual analysis, and you record those in our tool, those will override the computed complexity in all the reports. And so as you kind of go down this path of going further and further in this direction, the numbers that you see in your reports will get better and better, because we're always going to use the manual complexity. And there's even some flags you can put on your report so you'll know when you're looking at a 4, is that a 4 that came from a computed complexity, or a class rule, or manual analysis. And so that would be helpful when you're looking at those complexity reports. In determining application complexity, and I started mentioning this already, the complexity should be based on how hard it will be to rebuild in SharePoint. And there's a lot of things that were hard to do in Notes that are a lot easier in SharePoint. So I mentioned one example of the simple approval process that really goes for a lot of the simpler workflows. If it was a workflow where you're routing information to an approver, or maybe a couple of approvers, maybe it gets routed if the dollar amount is over a certain amount, or certain conditions. These are things that were built in Notes with a lot of code, with button events and agents and form saved, query saved events, and things like that. In SharePoint, this is often a lot easier. Workflow in SharePoint is declarative workflow, and it's all based on a rules-based engine, where someone who's not a hardcore developer can just author a simple set of rules in SharePoint Designer and implement the same functionality. So again, understand how hard it's going to be in SharePoint to rebuild this stuff. Now, there's probably some things that are harder in SharePoint. If you have a form with tabbed sections, that's actually harder to do in SharePoint than it was in Notes. So again, understand how hard it's going to be to rebuild something in SharePoint as you're doing this manual analysis of complexity. And as you're doing this, you need to factor in the possible targets. Some organizations have purchased the enterprise license for SharePoint, and then they have InfoPath form services available. Other organizations, they only built a standard license, so they might or might not have the InfoPath clients, but they don't have InfoPath form services. So all these things will kind of impact actually the cost of migrating. So really, something may be simple to migrate to some targets and harder to migrate to other targets. You can't do an analysis totally without understanding whether you're going to be able to use InfoPath, or whether you're going to be able to use third-party web parts. We've talked before about how the Quest web parts can be a big game changer in terms of the complexity of migrating a lot of applications. And so if the customer has Quest web parts, or is willing to install Quest web parts in their production environment, then that it's going to be simpler to migrate it. And so certain things, like I mentioned the tab forms, those become easy now, because you can do tab forms in Quest web parts much more easily. Same thing with third-party workflow tools. If you've used different workflow tools like Nintex or K2, or whatever, that again changes how much it will cost to migrate something. So as you do this complexity analysis, there's a few different outputs that come out of it. In addition to just a complexity number, you might come up with a list of recommended targets. So the analyst might say, this is a complexity level 3, and we recommend we use InfoPath list forms for that one. The estimated cost, of course, you might be computing how many hours you think it's going to take to migrate something. So in our tool, you can record costs in terms of hours or dollars. And just to be clear, we do not try to compute cost with our tool, but we will record the manual estimations that your team comes up with, and so you can roll it up into reports. We also allow you to track these things at the class level or the database level. So you could put an estimated cost for doing the design migration once for the template, and then you can have an incremental cost for doing the actual moving of data for every instance. If you have a template where 50 databases use the same template, there's going to be a one-time cost for migrating the design of the template, and then an incremental cost that you incur 50 times. And so our tool is good at kind of tracking all that and helping you. I think the best manual analysis projects will also point out what the trade-offs are. You might have an application with a really fancy form, but the analyst will say, well, I think that the standard SharePoint form would be good enough here. We'll just lay out the fields. And we like I showed you last week in our design migration scenario, we'll just use this default SharePoint form with all the fields laid out nicely. But if the customer wants to get the full look and feel, it's going to cost more. So the analyst might recommend, I would suggest considering the compromise where we give up on the look and feel of the old notes form, because I think the new SharePoint form layout will be good enough. And so this really helps two things. It helps the customer understand what their trade-offs are, and it helps them truly save money. But also, it helps you present quotes and estimates for doing this work that aren't all based on the worst case scenario. If you do an analysis report that assumes that every single feature and every single form has to get migrated, then those are going to look like really expensive jobs, and you're less likely to basically win the project. We've seen plenty of deals killed because people gave them the estimate for doing the really high-end full soup to nuts migration, and then if someone's got thousands of databases and they multiply out that cost for doing the expensive migration, it gets really prohibitive, and they say, well, we better stay on notes, or they'll say, well, we better keep looking for another partner. So we have seen that happen in more than a few cases. So if you can, in the beginning, communicate to your customers that there's some choices you make and we want to recommend some compromises that will save you money, then you're delivering more value to your customer. And the customers usually recognize that and they appreciate that, and then they can go back to the business and say, well, here's the compromise that the SI recommended. We have a range of costs that we can decide to take on for this project. Now, the final thing you need to factor in is what the migration tool can do. It always bothers me when someone says, well, we have an estimate to do a migration, but they weren't taking into account the fact that they have our tool. So they did the estimate before they learned what the tools can do. For example, last week I demonstrated how you can now, with version 6.1, you can migrate views from Notes over to SharePoint. So if you were using some other tool that didn't migrate views, your estimates would have to be higher. Not only that, if you were using version 6.0 of my tool instead of version 6.1, your estimates would have to be higher. So you really need to think about what the tools can do. At this point, I would think about what version 6.1 can do for you and make your estimates accordingly. I want to review one more time here also what we talked about last week, just really quickly, where the tools help in general with design migration. We can migrate the schema of an application, so we can look at the schema and we can try to help you build a similar schema in SharePoint, either in a list or in an info path form. We can also generate content types based on those notes forms, again with all the same fields and field types that you had in notes. We can do the design migration of forms, and we can give you a choice of whether you're going to go to InfoPath document forms or InfoPath list forms. And like we talked about last week, kind of one of the next things we're going to be doing over the next 3 to 6 months is doing form migration over to SharePoint Designer forms, ASPX forms. So that's obviously will help that scenario too. But we're not there yet, so we want to talk about what we have today. And then with our new release, we migrate views, SharePoint views over to Notes views. And so for all these things, we don't do 100% of the work, but we do a lot of it. So if your form had some code on it, we're not going to migrate the code on that form. We try to help you understand where the missing pieces are so your developers can quickly go in and decide if you need to do something about that. So beyond the strict design migration, we also help with complex apps, and these are things that you need to be aware of when you're computing how much work it's going to take to migrate something. So we have all our analysis features that I mentioned. In addition to the design analysis, we also have data analysis by forms used, which is again helpful for understanding if an application had a dozen forms in it, which ones are actually being used as in actual data documents. These are the ones that are kind of the true document types that you need to think about migrating. When we're migrating things out of notes, we give you a choice of using formulas and extracting multivalued items and a number of things for kind of picking apart and getting into every nook and cranny of your application. So we're really very complete in terms of extracting complex data and transforming it as we're migrating it. And then the target side, we've talked a lot over the last few weeks about dealing with complex field types. And then next week we'll talk about web part pages and how we can do web part properties. We can migrate approval status and the state of an in-progress workflow. And we can really help you restructure your data as you migrate things by automatically creating things and putting them in folders and subfolders, or putting them in document sets, similar case where we can reorganize all your documents and attachments into document sets. Version information, we can preserve if your application has versioning. So like if it's domino.doc or some custom application that has a concept of versioning, we can map that over to SharePoint versioning. And of course, we support fully the use of custom list templates and site templates, and we can automatically provision things, both lists and sites, using your custom templates if you want us to. So just a quick recap of some of the ways our tool helps with the design migration and then the other aspects of complex applications that you want to think about. And so factor these things in as you're doing your estimates of the migration work. So here's a slide that kind of puts a lot of it together, and you can download this presentation. So I know this is a lot to read in one page here, and I'll try to give you just a high-level overview of what we're talking about. Usually people want to think about classification in terms of these levels of application complexity. And so this is different. This is not the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that the tools will spit out. This is more like a real world classification. It's really based on how hard it's going to be to migrate, how much work you're going to put into it. So the least expensive ones are the standard templates. Basically, you're deciding that you're going to migrate this over to a SharePoint template. Now notice this caption here, agreement with the business owner. So this is not purely based on how complex it was in notes. It's really based on what you're deciding to do with it. So even if it was some custom application, if you're deciding to migrate to a standard template, to a standard discussion list or to standard document library, we classify that as a simple application. Even though it might have been complex in notes, you sat down with the business owner and you said, well, we're going to migrate this to a simple document library and have done with it. And that's all based on the value of the application. In these cases, Notes Migrator for SharePoint can automate all the standard templates, document libraries, discussions, team sites, quick places, and so on. Contact lists, calendars go in here too. All these things should be fairly simple to migrate. And these numbers are really going to vary, of course, in different applications, but we find it common to have 20% or more of the applications. You're just going to get the content over and put it in a simple document library. So very related to that is the archive case, and so we've showed you doing render with form. We talked about this in, I think, our session 1, where we can take any application, no matter how complex it was in notes, and we can just render it to a nice rich text document, and you can then put it in a document library or a list. We can even format it as a Word document. And so if the business is deciding you don't need the functionality anymore and you just want to render it, then it's again going to be a fairly simple application. These are all very predictable. The time to migrate these things are just going to be based on the content, on the volume itself. And so people often ask us, how long per gigabyte to migrate, and we don't usually like to publish those numbers because it varies so widely. I was talking to a customer yesterday who just an offshore team had a horrible internet connection, and then it was taking them 2 minutes to migrate every document, and so that's just obviously not going to fly. But the point is, it varies so widely. we can migrate some applications very, very quickly and others are going to take longer. So it depends on the application, it depends on what you're migrating, it depends on what features you're using, it depends on how many formulas you're using to select the data, and so on. So we don't tend to publish those numbers, but the point is you can test this in your environment and it can be very predictable once you've got some benchmarks in your environment. These simpler ones, you have very little upfront design work or design migration work. You do a few tests, and then you measure the volume, and then you can predict those very, very easily. So then we get into some of the custom applications where you actually want to take some of the complexity over. So what we call a low complexity application is one where you've decided you're going to stick to just browser level of configuration, either because the application is simple or it's because it's not worth much. And so you might decide to accept some reduced functionality, but you can be migrating to something where you're just doing browser level customization. You're going to go in and spend some time getting the schema the way you want it. Some of the demos I've done have been in this area. A lot of the demos I've done have been in this area where I spent a lot of time just getting the schema and renaming the fields so they're user friendly, and reorganizing things, and maybe turning on your simple approval process and turning on some of the other SharePoint browser level customization things. And so this is something where our tool can do all the content migration and the schema migration. And of course, we're preserving all the security. And the security really goes for all of these. And this is something that really junior level developers can do, or even power users. We've seen some organizations decide that for simple things, anything in this level, we're going to let the customers do this part themselves. We'll train some of the customers to run these tools to do this level of migration and save the tough ones for the consultants. So this is a common way to go. Microsoft sometimes recommends this practice where the SIs will focus on these and the end customers are responsible for doing these. Of course, it all depends on your business, how you're going to do that. The medium level complexity applications, these are the ones where you're deciding you're going to stick to designer tools like SharePoint Designer or InfoPath Designer, and possibly using some third-party web parts like the Quest web parts. These are things that a mid-level SharePoint developer can do, and you don't have to write code. You still want to be a pretty smart SharePoint guy. You want to be experienced at how to lay out a good SharePoint site. A lot of the cases where you're doing some custom styles in your SharePoint would fit in here. These are cases where the tool can migrate all the schema and all the content, plus it can do some of the form and view migration, like I showed you last week. Also the migration of the approval state, so we can take the fact that there was some field in notes that represented approved or pending, and we'll migrate over to the way SharePoint wants to see it. The cool things I showed you about migrating to document sets, dealing with managed metadata fields and lookup fields and so on, that kind of stuff kind of falls into this. So I said 20% here. Really some people decide that this is going to be where most of the stuff is going to fit. So a lot of applications decide we're just never going to do anything at this level. So if you're going to, for example, Office 365, you're not going to be able to do these highly complex ones. So you're going to say, we're going to just cut it off here. Whatever we can do with designer tools, we don't want to write code anymore, and we don't want to have to maintain code anymore. So even if there's some reduced functionality, we're going to set a policy that says we're going to stick with this medium level complexity. So that would make this number go up if you made that decision. Now, the high level complexity, these are the ones where you're deciding, okay, this application is worth it. So notice I say high complexity and high value here. This application is complex and it's worth rebuilding using Visual Studio, building custom web parts, building custom pages, building custom workflows in Visual Studio. And so this is where you're going to bring in your C# developers and so on. And you're going to be doing things like doing probably a lot more work with content types, which our tool can do. The content type generation can migrate workflow state. I showed you some of our data normalization, and these are kind of approximate buckets. You might do data normalization in a mid-level application, but we're trying to kind of give you a sense of where the tool normally fits in these level applications. But if you have something that complex, it may start falling into this high complexity ranking where you're going to be using, real Visual Studio level development. 10% is hopefully actually high. We've seen cases where people want to bring in this level of cost in migrating 10% of their applications. probably if I redid this slide now, I want to bump that down a little bit, because what we're finding is that with SharePoint 2010, a lot more things can fit into designer level complexity or below. And people just don't want to have to maintain a lot of C sharp code in the new world. So they're trying to keep this down. They'll save this for the new development they want to do. But in terms of migrating old notes applications, they're trying to keep this down to more like 5% or less in some cases. So again, have that conversation with the business, let them know how much it would cost to do an application this way versus this way, and let them make the trade-offs as to how valuable it is. Finally, there's some that we don't migrate to pure SharePoint, and these are the ones where it's really not a good fit for SharePoint. Either there's just a ton of transactional data, um, that just belongs more in SQL Server or something, or some external system, and so they don't actually put them in SharePoint lists and libraries. Now, even for those applications, the tool can help with some of those. Notes Migrate SharePoint can migrate all content to SQL Server. So if you're building a SQL Server app, you're in good shape because we can migrate to SQL Server. And like I'll show you at the end of the day today, we can migrate things to XML. So if you're planning to take this content and put it off in Microsoft Dynamics or some other external system, you might want to use our tool to export all the data to XML and then pump it into some other system that way from the XML file. And now we're getting to the area of triaging the value of the applications. And so the first level is going to be done with the tools, where first you can use the reports the tool gives you to tell you when was it last used, how much was it used, how complex it is in terms of which forms are used in actual data documents. And so these are the things the tool can give you, but like I said, you follow up with the business level analysis where you talk to the business owners and figure out how business critical it is, whether they can live with migrating it to simple templates or whether they really need all that functionality and how much of it they need, whether they need the old look and feel, and so on. And some people do this by just manually surveying the business owners. They go around and talk to them. Some people would actually have an application where they would survey the end users. The kind of questions you want to ask them is, how useful is the application? Do you want the content? Maybe they say, we don't use that application anymore, but we really need the content. So this would help you figure out whether you want to archive this stuff in SharePoint, and so you can use SharePoint search and things like that. Figure out what is the functionality that they really need. Try to apply the 80-20 rule. So you figure out which 20% of the features will get 80% of the value here. We really use these agents all the time. These things, I don't even know who uses that one. So you figure out which functionality is really being used. Do you really need the same look and feel that you had in Notes? Can you live with the default SharePoint forms? A big one is, can you reduce the number of views? It was really easy for end users to create views, and so they often just added more views and more views to their Notes databases. They don't necessarily need that done by the migration team. Often what makes sense is to pick a few views that you really need in the application. If over time users decide they want to look at things in different ways, they can still just go rebuild their, power users can go build new views easily in SharePoint. So we try to focus the migration on just the core views that are really needed, and then come back later and let end users build additional views if they need them. And then also we found that by using things like SharePoint Managed Metadata, the UI in SharePoint reduces the need to build lots of views, because with the new SharePoint search filtering, you can quickly just drill down into the data you need without having to build special views for that. You can more easily sort things the way you want in SharePoint, so you don't have to have a million different views that sort things different ways. So really think hard about how you can reduce the number of views here. A lot of the customization in an application, it has to do with outline controls and navigation controls. I encourage your end users to think about whether they really need that, because if you can just live with this default quick launch area without having to rebuild fancy navigation constructs, that will help. Similarly, there's a lot of buttons and actions that are on the views and forms and notes. Which ones are really needed, and is there a simpler way to do that in SharePoint? And can you live with the canned workflows? Maybe the canned workflows in SharePoint don't exactly look like the way they looked in Notes, but maybe the new one's good enough. So you got to talk to the business to figure that out. Before, we had 4 different approval codes, but we really could make it fit into pending, approved, and denied, in which case you can switch over to using the out-of-box approval process instead of rebuilding a workflow. So the general theme here is, can we compromise to do things the SharePoint way? If you're a partner consulting with a customer, you're the trusted advisor. You're the one who can give the business the news that they can save some money by simplifying things. And so I really consider this your job first and foremost to educate the users on the opportunities to do things the SharePoint way and help people save some money. Here's some general recommendations about running the migration projects. We talked a little bit about this. You need to have some notes experience, or I should say some people on your team should have some notes experience, because when you're trying to look at a notes application design and understand what it does, nothing substitutes for going into Domino Designer and looking at the form design and looking at the code in the button event or the agent. It'd be good if some people on your team had notes experience. This is also very useful if you want to write formulas, because our tool, as you've seen before, allows you to write formulas when you're migrating things. So very useful to have this notes experience for that kind of thing as well, to write formulas in our tool to translate data and select data and so on. But more important to have the SharePoint development experience, because when you're doing this migration project, you're going to be going as fast as you can and trying to migrate many applications. Most of the work is going to be in rebuilding, either customizing or developing things in SharePoint. And then you need a migration tool experience. So hopefully anyone who's doing migration work understands all the stuff that is in these training sessions. It takes a while. It takes a while to learn what the tool can do and kind of get the idea of how you would translate various notes things over to SharePoint things, and how you might use the tool to massage data, or figuring out that the tool can do document sets or Word documents or publishing pages. And so those first projects, there's a big learning curve there. Really, all three of these areas, there could be a learning curve. If you're new to SharePoint, if you're new to Notes, don't base everything based on the learning curve. Don't say, well, it took us 2 weeks to do the first application because we were learning so much along the way, and so we're going to multiply that out by 500 applications. Take the hit of the learning curve yourself, and don't make that part of your customer estimates, and don't multiply that out, because it will get a lot faster when you do number 5 and number 10 and so on. You'll find that you get the hang of it and things go a lot quicker as you go along. So we recommend that you start with simple applications. Some customers like to say, well, let's start with our most complex application, because if we can do that one, we know we can do everything. And I understand the reasoning there, but it's really not a good idea in my opinion. Start with your simple ones, and then you get to have some successes. Let the users see what a document library looks like in SharePoint, and let them see what a custom application that's migrated just to a simple list looks like, or wiki pages looks like. The customers can start getting comfortable with what these things start to look like on the SharePoint side. And so then as you get to the more complex ones later, you'll have a much better framework for having that discussion with, well, here's where we could bring in a custom workflow tool or web parts or Visual Studio development and so on. But you need to understand what the basics are before you understand what you want to build on top of that. So typically people run projects in phases. They'll pick a group of applications that kind of go well together, and then migrate those, and then kind of do a debriefing on that, look at what happened with that set, then do the next one. And so often a pilot phase is very helpful. Most customers will now do a pilot before they get into serious migration work. And so the pilot phase helps them with their estimates of bandwidth in their environment and things like that. But again, if your pilot phase is your first migration project, don't base everything on how long it took to do that pilot. Recognize that you were going through a learning curve there, and it's not going to be like that with your future project necessarily. Also, we have a lot of things that slow projects down in the pilot phase, like getting the right access to things, getting the import service set up. So those take days too sometimes in the worst cases. So even though you're doing all your infrastructure set up in your pilot phase, don't let that confuse how long it's going to take to do things when you get going. Now, as you're kind of lumping your projects together into logical phases, some people look for applications that have the same user community or are solving the same business unit, or the same application type. So some people migrate all their document libraries together in one phase, or some people do it based on the target site. Everything that's going to this certain site gets migrated together. Now, one thing that people often do is they try to migrate applications together that are likely to cross-reference each other. So if they have a lot of doc links or lookups between the databases, then that's a kind of a natural group of applications that you might want to migrate together in one chunk. And really, it comes down to which things should go live together. So if you have 4 or 5 applications that you kind of want to go live as one chunk, that obviously defines a nice phase for your application. Now, there's a special case if you're doing Office 365 dedicated or any other environment where you're going to be promoting content based on migrating content databases. So Office 365 dedicated, you basically have to populate one content database and then you unplug the database and then ship it off to Microsoft and they plug it in into your production site. And many internal applications are done the same way. One content database gets migrated and populated with content and goes through QA, and then you promote the content by just taking the whole content database and moving it to production. So that's a case where this factor overrides everything because you really want to completely populate that whole content database with whatever applications want to get on there, and then you move it to production. So that kind of is a natural grouping for your migration work. And then the final recommendation here is just to manage user expectations. And remember that you're selling the value of SharePoint here. So, let people know it's going to be different. You're going to try to save them some money by taking compromises. So you're going to be encouraging them to give up certain notes things that are hard to do in SharePoint, but at the same time, they want to understand what SharePoint can do for them. Show them how cool managed metadata is and how useful it is, and get them used to using SharePoint search to find things, and the value of having web-based forms versus applications that are replicated to the client, and things like that. So SharePoint has a lot of value in it. Document sets are really cool. The built-in approval process. So some people don't think it's their job to sell the value of SharePoint. I think it helps the project go nicely if you let people know what they're getting. And when you're demoing a new application, don't just be on the defensive and say that we covered all your needs that you had in notes. Show them you can also do this here. Now that you're in SharePoint, look at how cool search is, and so on. Here's a common life cycle that we see many corporations adapt. You do your pilot projects, you do your sample content migration first. For a complex application, you would typically first try to migrate the application, and then while you're doing this, you're of course doing the schema migration. You're taking all the notes fields and field types, all the text fields and date fields and choice fields and all that, and you're provisioning usually a custom list in SharePoint with all those fields. So you're doing the schema migration and the sample content migration. And you might even try some different flavors here. You might do one to a custom list and do one to a wiki page or one to a Word document. And then this gives users a chance to kind of see what their choices are with terms of your target types. And then enable some of the easy things in SharePoint, turn on the approval process or turn on version control. At that point, it's a good time to show it to the business users and tell them you haven't done any development yet, but you want to show them what the content looks like in SharePoint, and you might show them the different choices that you migrated, and then start discussing what the gaps are and the options are. So show them the migrated content with some of the simple things enabled, and then say, well, if you wanted the original look and feel of your form, we could do it this way. Or if you wanted the full workflow that you had, here's how much it would take to do that. If you really need this navigation to work exactly the same way, we could build a web part here, but let them know what the trade-offs are and let them know what the cost of each of these choices are going to be. And then once you've done that, go back and complete the customization. And if it's just a one-off, then just create that custom list. If it's something that you might reuse, you can save this as a custom list template or a custom site template, and then do the end user acceptance testing on that configuration. Now here's the new look and feel we have. Here's all the functionality we built. Make sure they're okay with that. Make sure we didn't miss anything. And then once you're past that point, redo the migration. Blow away this sample content that you migrated because it's out of date now anyway, probably. And our tool, you just check the box that says delete the prior contents, and then remigrate all the content and or deploy to production. So I put a slash there because some people migrate all the content directly to production. Some people still need to go to a staging environment first, migrate the content, and then deploy to production. Depends on how your environment is set up. And we talked about that in the deployment options a couple weeks ago. So as you're going through this life cycle, our tool, the migration console, can track key pieces of data. We track not only the computed complexity, but then the manual overrides you did as you did your manual analysis, and any cost estimates you figured out along the way. The disposition is what you want to do with the application. You want to kill it. You want to migrate it to just a custom list. You're willing to migrate it to full level development. So this disposition would often map to the table of what level you want to migrate things to. Recommended targets would be: do you want to migrate this to InfoPath? Do you want to migrate this to a publishing page, or just a simple list, or to SQL Server? Responsibilities: you can use our tool to keep track of who's in charge of doing the analysis work, who's in charge of doing the design migration, and so on. And then the priorities: this should be a phase 1 application, phase 2, phase 3. And then we also keep track of tasks as you complete them. So when you do an analysis, we'll check the checkbox automatically in our tool that says the analysis was done. Or you can decide to turn that off, and you only check that when they've been done manually. And some things are only manual. So there's a step in our tool for manually reviewing the migration target. Obviously, that's a manual task, and so you'd go into our tool and check that automatically. So all this data is things that you can use in our database views. So you can add these to your views, and you can manage your project in our migration console this way, or you can design custom reports that use this data, or you can export it and view all this in Excel or something like that, like we talked about in previous sessions. Okay, so with that, I'm now going to finally switch over to some demos here. I don't want to do a whole lot of demos. I just want to recap where some of these pieces are. So these are all my local databases, and just pick some of these and say I want to do an analysis. And we've showed you this before. In particular, I want to do the design analysis. And if I just check these boxes, it would do the design analysis and compute the complexity number, and I'd be able to look at all the, how many forms, how many agents, and how many views. Now, if I wanted to do that best fit detection, I can say I want to automatically compare the design of each of these databases with all the predefined templates I set up in my technical classes. That would tell me which class I'm closest to. And so this would help me assign the right class to the database if I couldn't use the automatic assignment. And then if I wanted to compare every application with its template, I would check this box. And so that would give me more details about. And then this one is the one that copies all the databases to my local folder. So like I said, we only keep a copy based on replica ID. So by default, if we already saw the replica ID before, we're not going to copy it down. Now, if you're going back and reanalyzing again, you did your discovery 3 months ago and you want to redo it again, and you think the designs might have changed, you can go ahead and override this and say recopy it based on the ID. It's going through the design scan. Okay, so now we've analyzed those 6 of those databases. One of them wasn't really there, even though it was in my console. I must have deleted it. If I open this now, I can see that we have design analysis detail. And so here's the summary of how many forms and views, and we list out each form and view that's used there. This application had 47 forms in there. I can look at the details and say, this is a 50% match with the address book template. And if I want to, I can set this as a technical class for its database. And now that I've assigned this as the technical class for the database, I can measure the deviations and I can redo the scan. And so I can look into the details between this database and its template. So I can see these are the forms that were customized. This little not equal sign in the icon, this means this is something that was modified. This is something that was added, and so on. There wasn't any deletions here, but there's another icon if I deleted something from the template. So this is where you would go find a lot of this design comparison information. If I wanted to view the design, I can either go to the database, and this would open the Notes client and go to the database, or I can look at the design, and this would open the database in Domino Designer, or I'll do this one, which is open the local design copy. So remember, this is a new feature in 6.1 where we took a little local copy of our database. And so we're now viewing the copy of the database. You can see in the caption, communicator address book design copy. And so this is a full copy of the database. Me as an analyst, I don't have to be connected to the Domino environment anymore. I can look at all the forms and views and so on. And if you look at the address here, you can see that this is in our special design copies folder, and then it's named by the replica ID. And I could just take this whole folder and copy it off to my offshore team, and they can do this work offline. I open this again. I want to show you where we will put some of this estimation stuff, the triage and estimation information. So if I go to my migration status tab, I can see this is where we would record who the database owner is, and you can set up a predefined list of people here, or you can just, I'll be lazy and just but obviously it would make more sense to put a set of names here, and then it would become available in your drop down. Same with the business owner. As you identify who the business owner is, you can keep track of that here. And then your priorities. This is, I want to analyze this in phase 1, and ultimately I might say I want to migrate this in phase 3. And then I can assign this to a certain person who's in charge of analyzing this and migrating and so on. The disposition, you can set up your own custom list of dispositions. These are the ones that come defined in our tool. Migrate to standard targets, migrate to customized targets, migrate to developed targets. This might be the high complexity one. Or some of these might be leave in place, end of life. And you could really develop a full set of things here. If you might use InfoPath list forms in your migration, go ahead and set up a disposition for migrate to InfoPath list forms, or archive only would be a good choice to put in here. And any other comments you want to add. So the analyst would probably add comments here to say, we think this would be a good candidate for this reason, and you can add any comments you want here. So not a big area to do stuff. Many people will manage their projects in other tools like Excel or things like that. But if you want to manage this stuff, you can do it all right here. And here's the parts where we keep track of the status. So when I've finished analyzing my data, I would come in and check this box. Now, some of these things are migrated automatically, and some of these things are only manual. Now, if I wanted to go into my options and go over to my console tab, I can see that we automatically are going to set the migration status as operations are performed. So if you didn't want the tool to be updating these, just turn these off, and then you have to manually set them yourself. And here's where you set up that list of database dispositions and so on. In the complexity tab, here's where I would go and override the complexities. After I did my manual analysis, or after I had the conversation with my business owner, I decided that even though this was a highly customized address book, we're just going to take it as a simple contact list in SharePoint. So maybe I'm going to say I'm going to override this, and I'm going to decide it's 1. And then when I do that, notice that when I make this change, this becomes locked. And so here's what I mean when I say that the manual complexity overrides the computed complexity. Even though we computed this complexity level 2 for the DEI, or level 5 based on a kind of a raw look at the design elements, we're going to override this and say it's a manual level complexity 1. And then on the migration effort, I'm going to say here's the amount of work it's going to take to migrate this. It's going to take 1 hour of analysis. We don't have to do any development. We're going to use a default migration job because we're just going to do the context list. And let's just allow an hour in case it's big, and then an hour for verification. So there's our estimate for doing this database. And so again, all this piece of information can be used in our views, and you can add them to a custom report or export them to external reporting systems. So let me go into my classification rules and look at my rules for address books. I could put in rules here to say, now, based on the class, every address book is going to be a level 1, or every address book we're going to migrate to a standard target. And I could go on and say every address book has a certain database owner or priority. Whatever I want to set, just check the box. Also for effort, I can say I want to automatically assign efforts. And I showed you this type of thing a lot before. I can pick a bunch of databases and I can say apply class rules, and these top two are the ones that automatically assign all the status information, the triage information to these databases based on the class rule, and assigns the effort based on the class rule. So that would go through and update these things on the individual databases. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears here and talk about the link tracking system. So in our tool, I've showed you a number of times how our doc links work throughout the migration process, and what we do is we keep track of all the documents we ever migrated in a SQL Server database, and we also keep track of which documents have doc links in them. So we have the locations of the new documents and which documents have doc links in them. These are all saved in our link tracking database. And when we migrate a document that has a doc link in it, we convert the doc link into what we call a dynamic link. And what that is basically a URL that points to our redirector page. So instead of pointing the user to a document, we have a URL that points to our redirector page and passes the document ID of the document the user is trying to get to. So when the user clicks on that document link, they go to our redirector page, and then they're redirected to the last known location of that document. So if it was migrated to a web part page, we'd redirect them to that web part page. Or if they haven't been migrated yet, we'll redirect them back to the notes client to view the document there. So the point is that things can keep moving around. A week later you can migrate more documents, and then instead of being migrated to notes, that same link would migrate you to some other location. And we support linking between all of our different targets. So we can have a link that goes from a list item over to a Word document or PDF document or whatever, and vice versa. And we also use the same system for the navigation menu. So when I showed you our Quicker and Quick Place demos before, when you clicked on the navigation area and it redirected you to that subroom or to that other folder, we were using that same link tracking system. We support web links as well. So if you, instead of putting a real notes doc link in there, you just put a URL in your document that pointed to some other web-enabled notes document, we would recognize that as a link as well, and we would process it the same way. And this is particularly useful for things like Quick Place or Quicker, where you don't have true doc links. You're editing these documents on the web, and so all you can do is you can paste URLs between documents into your pages, and so we'll detect them. Now you have to enable this. You have to set up the link detection for each Domino server here. Now our redirector page is an ASPX page that we deploy when you install our solution. So this is questlink-tracking.aspx, and there's code on this page to take the ID of the document you're looking for and go redirect you to the right place. Now there's actually two versions of this page. One is the full version, which gets deployed when you install our front-end services on your server, and this is the one that has full functionality. This one can actually go look back in this database and redirect you to the right place. We also have the sandbox version. Any site administrator can deploy this without a central admin guy getting involved, and you can deploy it to really lockdown environments such as Office 365. Now that means because it's limited and running in the SharePoint sandbox, it does not connect to the database, so it has some limited functionality. It's still better than having a broken link because you get this friendlier looking redirector page, and we can still redirect you back to notes, but we can't do that lookup in the database to find its new location. So the answer for a page like this would be to finalize more frequently. So our link update and finalization tools, we have a version that runs in central administration. If you installed our front-end services central administration option, most people would actually use the client to do that nowadays. The central administration one is kind of older and out of date. The client-side tools are much better than that. So most people would use the migration console. And so the link update and finalization tools allow you to do analyzing all the links in the database, as well as updating them and finalizing them. So analyzing would basically tell you things like how many links are in a given set of documents and how many links are pointing to a given set of documents. So this is kind of useful to understand what's linking to what at a high level. It also finds broken links. So you might want to find cases where we've migrated something, but then you went and deleted that list, and so now there's broken links in our system. So it's good to identify what the broken links are. Our tool can allow you to update the links in our link tracking database, and this is useful when the host name is changed. So let's say you're about to take a content database and move it to production, and so now the host name of all your links are about to change. You might want to go and update all the links in our database, so now we can redirect you to the right URL when someone clicks on one of your links. So particularly useful for when things are about to change from staging to production. Now links may also be finalized at any time. So finalization is where we take those dynamic links that point to our redirector page and put in the permanent links instead. So once you've done this with all your links, once you've taken out all the redirector links and changed them to be permanent links, then you can remove the whole Quest system and you don't need your link tracking database anymore. So I guess the biggest caveat here is that final means final. Once you finalize something, it shouldn't be moving around anymore. You only want to do the finalization when you're no longer migrating things and things are not moving around. So we do allow you to finalize to a notes URL, but that's only good in like a Word document or something like that. If it's a link in a SharePoint page, you can't actually have notes URLs in SharePoint columns, so be careful about finalizing things to notes URLs. So the recommendation is usually to only finalize things that are pointing to migrated documents. You don't finalize things that are still pointing to notes documents. And I'll show you how to do that in our tool. And then if documents have moved, make sure you update the links in the link tracking database using this tool up here before you do the finalization, because when we finalize it, we're going to take the URLs that are in this database and write them permanently in the documents. We do handle links in staging environments pretty nicely. So this is one of the more complicated areas where you're migrating everything to a staging environment, and then later you're going to push this to production. How do you keep your links updated so that content is moved? Now, the first option is probably the best for the end users, and that's where you've still installed our front-end services in production, and so you can have that full featured link redirection in production. In that case, you just make sure you update the database as you move the content. We'll still keep redirecting you to the right place whenever you click on a link. You could click on a link in staging, it might migrate you to a production document. You could click on a link in production, it might migrate you to a staging document, or of course back to notes. Now, if it's a more lockdown environment, we can still do the finalization in production using the SharePoint 2010 web services if it's SharePoint 2010. So there you would install the sandbox safe link redirector solution so you don't have the broken links, like I said, and then finalize more often. Because the sandbox redirector can't redirect you to the SharePoint document, go ahead and finalize the links that are pointing to production now. So you can really, as often as you want to, every night if you want to, you can run a finalization process which will fix up all the links for the things you migrated today. And so you won't actually use this redirector link too often, only in the ones that haven't been finalized yet. And so it would redirect them back to notes, which works out nicely. Now, for a really locked down environment where you can't even install the redirector, or if you're on SharePoint 2007, where you can't install this sandbox safe solution and you can't finalize over the web services. If you're in SharePoint 2007 and you can't install the import service, then your only choice is really to finalize before promoting the content. So it's going to be important that you kind of plan to batch the content, so you're going to be able to finalize most links before you migrate. So if you have 5 databases that are likely to kind of cross-link each other, migrate all 5 of those databases to staging, finalize those links so we have permanent links, and then promote that content to production. Because once it's in production, if you don't have this import service installed, you're not going to be able to finalize things after the fact. So be sure to finalize things before you do the promotion in that case. And then, of course, only finalize links to the permanent production URLs. Be careful not to finalize things that point to a staging URL. Do the update in the database first, and only finalize the things that are production URLs. So if you have a mix of things in staging and production, you need to be careful as to how you specify what you want to finalize. You only want to finalize the links that are pointing to production documents, not the staging documents. So let's take a look at a demo here, and I'll show you how the link finalization works. So if I open one of the documents I migrated, and if I click on one of these links, if you look at the bottom here, you can see that this is a reference to the Quest link tracking.ASPX page. That's our redirector page, and we're passing the notes ID. So if I click on this, it should just automatically redirect me to wherever that document that I'm asking for ended up in SharePoint. Now, If I hadn't migrated that document, then it would have redirected me to the Notes client. Let's say I wanted to use my finalization tools now. I go down in the console, I go to the Tools node, and then we only have one tool so far, and that's our Link Analyzer, Updater, Finalizer tool. If you haven't been doing client-side link tracking, then you might need to go set up the connection to your link tracking database. If you've already been doing client-side link updating, then this is already configured for you. So if I want to do an analysis, I could specify I only want to look at certain documents that begin with a certain URL. So basically, I might go into, whatever level of depth of, I can do a whole server, I can do a certain site collection, I can only do a certain list, depending on how much of the URL I specify. And it just does a string comparison on that URL. And similarly, I could say I only want to look at documents that are pointing to a certain set of URL. So, there's a certain site that I'm about to promote to production. What other documents are pointing to that site? So I can select either way. My environment is small enough, I'm just going to do the whole thing here. So it's warning me this could take a long time, and it actually does take a long time. So out of my 12,000 documents, sorry, 1,200 documents, I'm not going to wait for all of them because it would take a few minutes to do that. And the reason it's taking so long is it's actually going to SharePoint and making sure that all the links we have are really still there. It's looking for broken links, among other things. And it's looking for who is pointing to me and so on. So I'm just going to cancel this and stop with the first 100 or so. And I can see that these are the ones we actually checked up through here. That's the first 100. And so a lot of these things in my link tracking database were demos that I deleted, and so they're showing up as not found, and some are found. So these are the things that was actually there. We can look at these documents in Notes or in SharePoint. So we want to understand what happened to them. And this is one of the more interesting parts. In this document, there's links to other documents, and there's actually one link to migrated documents and 2 links to non-migrated documents. And none of these links have been finalized yet. And then none of these links are unresolved. If I scanned the entire 1,200 documents, I probably would have found some documents that exist, but they have links that point to things that don't exist. So they're broken links in real data documents. So those are the ones I want to maybe go fix before I finalize them, because you don't want to finalize broken links. If I want some details, I can say this document is referenced in one other document. So there's one other document that points to me, and I can actually go look at that document and see whether it's finalized. And there's 3 links in this document that point to other documents. So very useful information. So these are links coming in and links going out of this document. And so if you aggregate this to a set of documents, you can get some interesting information about how many links are kind of pointing into these documents and how many links are pointing out to the documents. So that's the analyzer tool. There's options to filter this, to zero in. If you're trying to figure out what happened to one particular document, you can filter by the notes ID and other things and drill down. So that's the analyzer tool, kind of a summary version of that. The update tool is the tool where I want to rename links in the link tracking database. So this does not change the documents, but this changes the references in our database. So let's say I had a bunch of documents that started with http/staging, and I want to change the URL to http/production. So I could do this all in one fell swoop. If that was too sweeping, I just narrow it down. I could do site 1. Whatever you're about to promote to production, or maybe sometimes just the URL changes. Sometimes people were using the internal host name, but they realized they wanted to use, the full distinguished name here. So there's a lot of reasons you might want to change the URLs. But basically, now when we click on a link, we're going to redirect you to this URL for the real document. So we're going to update all these records here. Now this checkbox is kind of tricky to explain. Do you want to update the locations of referring documents? So let's say we're about to promote this site to production here. And usually you leave this on, but you don't check this box if you want to finalize your links before moving to a destination. So the locations of referring documents this is the URL our tool is going to use to go finalize the link. So even though we know it should be pointing to a production URL for end users, when we go update the documents to finalize it, we still want to look in the staging. So if you're going to finalize in staging, do not check this link. If you're going to keep the link tracking service going for a little while longer in production and then finalize in production, go ahead and check this link. And then when we do the finalization, we'll go look for it on production. The rule is if you plan to finalize your links before you move the content, then don't check this box. So I'm not going to do that now because I don't want to change the links in my database because I don't really have this. So the final tool is the actual finalization tool. So if I click on this, I can see here's the finalization work that I could do. So if I knew that I was done migrating this list or this site or whatever, I might say I want to go ahead and finalize everything that points to this site once and for all. So users who are pointing to this site, they might as well get linked directly to that site because I know I'm done moving things around in that site. So everything in my whole universe that's pointing to this site, I can put a permanent URL in there. So right now I'll just keep it simple. I'll say I'll just want to migrate all the documents that are in this list. And I have a choice now whether I want to link to migrated documents versus non-migrated documents. And the default is I want to link to migrate all the links to migrated documents. I want to finalize with the direct links. And that means we're going to take the new permanent locations and put them in there. In rare cases, you would also finalize links to the unmigrated documents. Now, you'd only do this if you're really done with your migration and it's the last chance you're ever going to get. You're about to uninstall Quest's link, redirect your page and all that. You want to finalize just something instead of Quest link tracking at ASPX. So you could put some other URL in there, or you could put in the original notes URLs. But remember, this doesn't work in SharePoint targets. So you'll actually it'll end up being an empty link because SharePoint will edit out a notes colon link. So only do this if you're migrating to things that are not SharePoint columns, but so if you're migrating to InfoPath documents or Word documents, then those can store notes URLs. So, but if you're done with your migration job, you might want to say everything that's pointing to a non-migrated document, you might want to just create some dummy page that has some message that says this used to point to notes, we never migrated it, sorry. It might be nice to have a friendly page that explains that instead of just having a broken link. So I'm going to leave that out and I'm going to go ahead and run this way. So I'm going to finalize the links to migrated documents only in that list. So the preview should tell me there's 40 documents in that list and there's 56 links in them. And there's also 3 documents have links to unmigrated documents. So those will not be finalized because I didn't check this box here. So let's go ahead and do this job. So we're actually going and updating documents, so it could take a little longer. Okay, so we're chunking through. Well, here's one that we did finalize. So you see this link no longer points to our Quest redirector page. It points directly to that SharePoint document. So if I click on it, it still ends up going to the same place, but I didn't go through the redirector page behind the scenes. So now it would be safe to pull out the redirector page. And just a couple more things we want to cover, more kind of miscellaneous things that are sort of high-level Uber capabilities that you should know about that kind of help you with the running large migration processes. And this is using our intermediate data files. So I think I showed you on the first session that you can run a job and save to an intermediate file. And what we do is we'll generate an XML file with all the notes data saved out into it. And if you're extracting attachments, we give you a choice as to whether you want to encode the attachments inside the XML file, or for performance, might want to keep them separate in a folder tree, because if we encode big binary attachments in the XML, that's a lot of processing time and it makes one giant XML file. It's often better to keep the attachments in a separate folder outside that XML file. And so if you're using client-side user mapping, we'll do the user mapping as we're extracting the data, and then the intermediate file will have all the map users stored in there as well. And includes any generation. If you're doing generation of Word documents, PDF documents, InfoPath documents, those are actually done on the client side when you're extracting the data. So we actually get these generated files as part of this intermediate data file format. And so that will give you some interesting options, which I'll show you later. I'll warn you that these documents are not complete. If these documents had links in them or references to attachments that are external to to these files, we don't actually fix up those URLs until we place them on the server. So this intermediate file format wouldn't have the URLs fixed up. And the same with doc links. So with this intermediate file format, you can now walk this over to some other machine or do this at some other time and say, now I'm going to do the second part. I'm going to run the job again with the load from intermediate file, and this would import the data without actually having to connect to notes anymore. So you can go to a different machine that doesn't have any notes DLLs on it or notes IDs. This could even be on the SharePoint server itself, and then run the import of this data file straight into SharePoint. And you need to have the same migration job that was used when exporting, because the migration job has all the mappings and what they mean kind of encoded in it. So if this was a different machine, you would move over the XML files plus the migration jobs, and then you could do the import on this other machine. So some interesting things that people have done with this technology. One thing is you can use this as a way to kind of view or edit the intermediate files before importing. So some people might export the data to an intermediate file and then write some other code to fix up the data in some way, clean up the terms that they want to use in their term store, or change the usernames to replace certain users with other users, just any kind of out-of-band fix-up of the data you want to do. It's pretty easy to write a .NET utility or a Java utility that kind of scans through this XML file and changes things however you want to change it. Normalizing data, we've seen all sorts of things done with this intermediate file, and then you import it the way you want to. And you could use this just to enforce compliance, make sure there's no swear words in there or disparaging references to somebody, and then you can clean up the data before you import it. Some people will actually just create this file from scratch. Instead of exporting it from notes, they're going to just write some routine to generate these intermediate file formats from some other system. So I just had a request the other day, how could I convert a DB2 database into SharePoint? Well, the answer is write some script to generate our XML file format from your external database, and then you can import it into notes. And when we're doing that import, as far as we're concerned, it came from SharePoint. We don't know the difference. And similarly, you can use this to export to external to other systems. You can run the export job, save it to an intermediate file, and then you can write some utility to take that XML data and put it in some other system like Oracle or Microsoft Dynamics or other things. Now, there is a special case where some people just want to pull out all the attachments and put them in a file share or something like that. They're not really going to SharePoint with that one database. They're just going to export the data out of notes using our tool, and then they might want to just take the attachments and put them in a file share that kind of represented the hierarchy they had in SharePoint. So we actually have a folder reorganization utility which will take this intermediate data file and just kind of put all the files in some order in the file system the way you want to put it. Now, I actually I forgot to put this up, but I'll put this up soon on the SharePoint for All community site, this little file reorganization utility. And this also works with generated files too. So if you used our tool to generate a bunch of Word documents from notes, we're going to export them in our own XML file format and our own subfolder tree. But if you want to use this utility, you can kind of reorganize things by category or by whatever you want to, build a nice tree of attachments in your file system. And I'll demo this tool so you'll see what it looks like. But before I get there, I want to also mention our command line utility. And this is a way to script your migration jobs. So our utility can run any migration job that you've saved to disk, and you can vary certain parameters. So for example, you might want to write a loop that ran the same migration job 10 times, but then each time you're going to be specifying a different source database, and each time you're going to be specifying a different target list. So you can run the same migration job over and over again, specifying certain parameters on the command line. And so again, this only applies to jobs that are in the file system. So if you've developed your jobs in the migration console, you need to export to the file system to use this. And then our log files are saved to the file system. And so if you want to, you could re-import them into the migration console afterwards. So one use case is to run one migration job in a loop, like I just mentioned. Another would be to automate import of data. Let's say your offshore team is writing migration jobs and extracting all the notes data, but they don't have a good connection to the SharePoint server. So they might send these XML files over to another team member who's local on site, and they would do all the imports of all the data. So very powerful capability here. A similar thing that happens is some people will develop all their migration jobs, write them to an intermediate file, and then import them into a test environment where users will QA all the stuff. And then once they get that right, they'll replay that same intermediate data file into production, and they'll rerun the migration job, pushing it into production. And so this is a case where it might be helpful to just automate that process in a script. And then the final use case is to run the same migration job over and over again on a schedule. So you might run this overnight. So you might say, well, this is a migration job I want to run after all the users have gone home. And so you would use some scheduling tool like Windows Scheduler to schedule the running of this migration job. Or you could even run the same migration job every night. And I've shown you our incremental migration features. Well, we're only going to migrate the documents that were changed or modified. And so you can basically effectively do a one-way replication process where you're running the same migration job every night, and you're using our incremental migration to just get the changes that happen during that day. And so that's very helpful for a coexistence period where users are still entering things in notes, and you want to not have just one day where you're cutting off completely, everyone flips over to SharePoint. One thing this is useful for is if you've got a lot of data, you might want to do a bulk migration job ahead of time, and then just do a catch-up job as an incremental migration, the last weekend. So maybe it's going to take you an entire week to migrate a bunch of huge databases, but you still haven't gone live in SharePoint. But then right before you go live, that last Sunday before you go live, you're going to script an incremental migration where you're going to just migrate over all the changes. So here's the syntax for that command line utility. And it's pretty simple. You specify NMSPCMD.EXE, that's our tool, and you specify the job that you want to run, and then you can override various things, either the source or the targets. You can either change the site name or the list name. You can specify where you want to import or export data from, so you can mix and match this. You can run the command line tool, and you can just do the import part or the export part. Or you could, if you didn't specify these, it would do the whole job straight from notes to SharePoint. And you can override pieces, like for selecting data, you can say I only want to migrate a certain view with this time, or a certain form, all the documents created with a certain form, or specify some selection formula. So you might automate running this job 10 different times, but each time you're going to specify a different selection formula because you want to put the data in different lists. And then you can override the log file where this goes to. So finally, just want to make a comment about other Quest products that you might use in your migration process, or your customer might use, kind of surrounding this whole migration project. So these are other Quest products that you should be aware of. So the Quest web parts for SharePoint, I mentioned a few times, this is good for rapid application development, and it just happens to solve a lot of the things that you get that can make a migration really expensive. such as designing really complex forms with tables and so on, or you want to do views with lots of levels of categorization, and you want twisties, or you want a really complex navigation control. The Quest web parts help you solve these things and can save you some development time. We have a couple other migration tools. The migration suite for SharePoint migrates other things other than notes into SharePoint. So if you're a consultant doing a notes migration project, you might also be asked to migrate some things from the file system or from old versions of SharePoint. So look at the migration suite for SharePoint. Deployment Manager is good for deploying from staging to production, or reorganizing from one site topology to another site topology. Site Administrator is just for managing your SharePoint sites, for making sure at the end of your migration, you might want to audit the site to see if all your compliance rules are being kept. It's a good tool for looking at sites, what the final size looked like, who has access to the site, whether the security is being done consistently. So it's a good tool for understanding the targets that you might be migrating to and whether they're at capacity or not, that kind of thing, and then looking after the fact and looking at what you have ended up with on the SharePoint sites. And then for non-SharePoint things, people often do notes migration projects. We have migration tools for notes, coexistence tools for notes. If you have a notes application that's sending out emails to end users, and all those users are off on an Exchange now, you might want to plug in this tool. So those old notes applications that you haven't migrated yet are kind of coexisting nicely with all your Exchange mail users. And then a whole reporting tool. Message Stats is a very popular reporting package for Exchange mail environments, but there's a notes plugin you can get to kind of look. It's sort of do a good analysis tool for the mail migration, as opposed to what I showed you for the application migrations. Okay, well, let's wrap up with one more quick set of demos here. And I just want to show you our import-export features real quickly here. So let's see. Let me start up our designer client. Let's go File, Recent Jobs. Let's do my standard document library to list. This is the demo I started with on the first day here. And I'm going to run this job, only instead of running the complete job, I want to save your intermediate file. Now this is a new UI that's in 6.1. If you're in previous versions, then you just click the Run Job button and you get a dialog that says, do you want to save your intermediate file or load from intermediate file? So it's the same thing. And here's where I want to save my intermediate data file to. Let me just put this on my desktop. And let's just call this test1.xml. And I could encode all the attachments in the XML file if I liked really big XML files, but I'll instead say I want to save all the attachments and generated documents in a separate folder. So we're going to create a subfolder. Because it was test1, it's going to be called test1 files. And so we're not going to go ahead and run that migration job, we're only running the export parts out of notes. This, by the way, can be interesting if you're kind of trying to figure out whether you're constrained by the SharePoint side or the notes side. If you're not sure which connection is slower, you can always separate out the SharePoint part and notes parts as a test to see, was it the SharePoint part that took a long time or was it the notes part that took a long time? So we've now done that, and I've got my XML file here. So let's just open that in Explorer. And let's go ahead and allow my navigation. So the first part you get is this database information section, and there's all the ACL information and then the schema. So here's all the columns that I migrated and their types and so on. So that's kind of all the header stuff. And then you have all the records. And so one record has a field, dot created is a date time, and here it is. Modified by is an array of strings, and here they are. And then because I'm doing client-side user mapping, in addition to modified by, I also have modified by mapped. And so here's all the um, sorry the Windows names for all these users. And so anytime you mapped any user field that you map to, we would get the same behavior. We'd create a mapped column if you're using user mapping. And then all these other metadata fields like the notes ID and so on, and then the actual data fields like subject, category, and then here's my big rich text field. So it's all just encoded HTML and so on. List of what file attachments got blocked, and a lot of interesting stuff here. So you could easily take an XML program and either modify some of these things or send this data somewhere else if you wanted to. Now the other part I got, because I said I wanted the file attachments external, you can see that we created this test1 files folder, and then we organized this folder by the universal ID of the document. And if I drill down here, here's all the attachments. And here's all the attachments of that document. This document had 3 attachments. So all this data is here, and if I was doing document generation, if I was generating Word documents or InfoPath documents, I would see those documents in here as well. So that's all good and fine. Now, if all I really wanted was the attachments, you would probably not think of this as a very good arrangement for those things. To have things organized by universal ID, wouldn't it be nice if I could display these attachments in some other way? And so that's what our little free utility is for. That's our folder reorganization utility. So if I run this utility now, I'm going to select that on my desktop, that test1.xml file. And I'm going to select where I want this to go. Let's just go to my desktop, make a new folder called out, and select that. And then what do I want to use to organize these things? So let's say I wanted to use the category to organize all these documents. And I could pick whatever field I wanted to. And by default, it's just showing the text fields that make the most sense. If you want to see other things, you could click that box. And so here's a preview. We're going to organize things by category, tree/oak, and put that attachment in there. Rich text, we'll get that attachment, and so on. And if I like it, I go, and then I can go to that folder. And so now we've generated a folder out on my desktop, and we've organized all of our attachments by the category. So I go into rich text tests, and here's all the attachments that were in that category. Trees, oak, so on. Okay. Well, that just about wraps things up. I'm also interested in taking any questions. And I'll display my link to my beta site. And I see there is one question now on the Q&A panel, so you can go to the Q&A panel and post your question, or you can unmute yourself to ask questions. But let's start with this one we have here. Can you migrate journals using Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1? The answer is yes. You can actually migrate Notes journals using any version of Notes Migrator for SharePoint. Even 1.0 could do that. It's just a very, very simple template similar to Document Library, and all the migration jobs that we've showed you, could work with journals as well, journal databases. That's just one of the standard SharePoint that's just one of the standard Notes templates. All right. Well, thank you very much for attending, and everyone have a great day.